You don't need a reason to help someone. Words to live by.
So I set my course, my battle begins. There's no mistaking this feeling. I feel no remorse, no I can't resist. I'm making a way.
I can't tell you how excited I am to be able to finally talk about this game. It's surprising I haven't really got into it before, because Final Fantasy IX is not only the first Final Fantasy game I ever played, but is one of my favorite games of all time, easily in the top 3, right up there with Sonic 3 and Knuckles and Alan Wake. I adore Final Fantasy IX in almost every conceivable regard, and I can't say enough good things about it. I think I haven't talked about it because, well, admittedly early on in my YouTube career, most of what I focused on were bad games. Going into them and screaming about them and getting so angry and edgy. I'm darkness, the curse, my fury knows no bounds! But with 9, it's like, I can't even find... How do I complain about this? I can't do it. Like, we're talking about a game that not only is one of my favorites, but also the game resonates with me on a personal level and is actually directly responsible for part of who I became as an adult. When I first played this game as a kid, there were so many components of it that I tried to adapt and make a part of myself, like the lessons I learned from the story and from the characters and things like that. And I think all of us who are not just writers, or, artists, people just in general that enjoy fiction can say that there's something that they experience that kind of changed them as a person. That's part of what art is, where, it resonates with people, it gets an emotional response, and sometimes it can change a person. Final Fantasy IX did that for me as a kid, and remember, I've always struggled with depression. I've been sad a very long time. I don't just be edgy just for the sake of it, it's just, sometimes life be that way. And in my case, there's some history that I'm not going to go into. But as a kid, I needed some hope. And in a way, Final Fantasy IX gave me a little bit of happiness, being able to experience something that wasn't painful or upsetting or hurtful. There are serious elements to the tale, and there are sad things that happen, but what I really love about Final Fantasy IX from a plot perspective is that it's always about overcoming that. And a lot of the Final Fantasy games are like this, but it wasn't quite driven in the way Final Fantasy IX handles it. I think that amounts to the characters involved. Before I talk about the gameplay and everything else about it, let's discuss the visuals, which are, for PlayStation standards, absolutely incredible. If it isn't the best looking PlayStation game ever made, it's up there. The only one I can think of that comes close to its level of competency in terms of a visual aesthetic is Parasite Eve 2. I don't even like that game, but I'm not going to dog it in terms of its visuals. Parasite Eve 2 is a gorgeous PlayStation game. But Final Fantasy IX is absolutely insane in terms of its visuals. Both the pre-rendered and even the in-game stuff looks great. Though I will tell you the visuals you're looking at are from the PC re-release, which did a little bit of upscaling, but not so much that it really changed that much about it. You could play this on the original PlayStation and still be blown away at how good they managed to make the game look. The sound design is incredible. This is one of my favorite soundtracks from any game ever made, period. And fun fact, Nobuo Uematsu, the man responsible for many of the old Final Fantasy game soundtracks, and a legend in the industry due to his incredible musical scores, he has gone on record saying that Final Fantasy IX was his actual favorite project to work on. So if that doesn't tell you how much he liked the music he was making, I mean, come on, you gotta give it that much at least. Looking at it on the surface, it seems to be a bit of a drastic shift in terms of the visual and overall art direction, since it adopts sort of a cartoony look to it. But I can explain this in the fact that 9 was meant to be a massive throwback to the old Final Fantasy games that some people had been missing up until this point. It was my first, so naturally that didn't work for me, but I loved it for what it was. Compared to 7 and 8, which had a lot more steampunk/sci-fi elements to them, 9 takes it back to classic fantasy. And while it still has stuff like airships to add that steampunk element, it's more like a typical medieval RPG, which is what the Final Fantasy series originally started as. And the art direction is meant to emulate that original style, to look more like the old sprites, except done in 3D, and they handled it very well. This put some people off, I think, particularly PlayStation owners, because you have to remember the old Final Fantasy games were mostly played by Nintendo gamers. The PlayStation fans got their taste of Final Fantasy from 7, which was a more modern take, and again with the sci-fi steampunk vibes going on. But 9 was meant to be a throwback, but it was a throwback to games that this audience may not have played at the time the game came out. So 9 was in some ways overlooked, and criminally so, because, you know, it's my favorite, and in many ways I think it surpasses the other two games on the platform. I love 7, don't get me wrong, it's a great game, but I will always love 9 a lot more. And 8 is, it's there. I just reviewed that. Do I have to go over it again? Because I'm not doing it. The other problem I think with 9 is the timing of release. 9 was released on the original PlayStation the same year that the PS2 came out. This was a last hurrah for that console. So many people may have overlooked it in that regard too, because they were going to get a PS2 and then get Final Fantasy X, which was critically acclaimed and considered one of the best RPGs ever made, at least on that platform. Whether you agree with that is whatever, but again, my favorite's 9. We're still talking about 9. Maybe I'll talk about 10 eventually. Now, see, now I brought up 10. Now here's what's gonna happen. Here's what's gonna happen. I will tell you what's gonna happen. Now that I brought it up, people, I already talked about 9. Well, what about Final Fantasy X? You mentioned Final Fantasy X. That means you played Final Fantasy X. You better give us a review, Darkness the Curse. Or Edge Rabbit, whatever you're calling yourself. I know who you are, and I know where you live. And you're gonna give me that review. Because I don't have the ability to process and give opinions of my own. I want to see what you have to say. Now! You got 3 hours! You don't have to yell at me. Okay? So now that we talked about the graphics and the visuals, what about the gameplay itself? Well, it's an open world RPG, as you might expect. In terms of being a JRPG, it's down to earth in that regard. Wandering around, exploring the world, interacting with characters, everything you'd expect from an RPG like this is there and done extremely well. The world building is exceptional. You really get a sense of the surroundings and the cultures you're in, and it really does a good job of showing, not telling. It doesn't explain everything to you, it just shows you that this is the way the world is and this is how it works. And it's presented in such a way that you can really ground yourself in and get immersed in the overall environment. As for the gameplay, well, the combat is interesting because on the surface you might say this is a typical turn-based RPG, and you would be only partially correct. While it does offer the turn-based style, the main focus here is the new ATB combat, which is kind of an evolution of the turn-based combat. The way ATB works is actually quite simple. Instead of taking turns and the gameplay effectively pausing while you go through the menu and think about what you have done to deserve this situation you're in, how many Phoenix Towns do you have left? You're gonna die soon! You better heal or else you're dead. And the world is doomed because of your failure as a player. Is that what you want? I need to chill out. Oh my god. The ATB system is always moving, which means that while you're sitting on the main menu, the enemies can still attack you, which is not something the old games used to do. You used to be able to kind of sit there and think, but with the way this game works, the combat very rarely pauses. The only time things pause is when you're in sub-menus, which I think was added as a bit of a relief to kind of, you know, deal with the time it takes to scroll through the menus. Because it'd be a little unfair if you were just trying to scroll to the spell you needed, and then you get slapped in the face while you're doing that and completely screwing up your gameplay. So I get that part. Like, even while you're doing your big summon moves and getting those animations, the gameplay's still going, so you can still set up attacks and magic spells while that's happening. And again, usually the game would pause during this kind of stuff, and, you know, everyone would just kind of stand there and stare at each other. But this kind of adapts the idea that these are real battles ongoing and that things change all the time. So it kind of meshes a sort of an action RPG aesthetic with the turn-based style. It's interesting in that regard. Also, there's a return to form with having an actual legitimate class system this time. Whereas 7 only had a loose class system where some characters were obviously kind of based on old classes and were going to be better towards doing certain things, like for example, Aerith was clearly meant to be a white mage. And then you had 8, which just didn't have classes at all, but here we're back to basics, where each character is given a class from the starting point, and that's their class, that's what they do well, period, end of discussion. There's no complaints. I hope there's no complaints, because this is what you got. And there's a beauty to that simplicity, where instead of being able to modify a character to do, like, another character's job, this time you know what each character is good for, and know what they're going to be be able to do, so you can build your party around them. It also helps push the player to actually use characters that they might have ignored because they were like put off by their designs or their attitudes, and get to know them a bit better from a combat perspective. Again, it helps immerse you in the storytelling going on by keeping those other characters around. The story also does a good job of making you mix up your party repeatedly, since the party splits fairly often early on, and you don't really get to modify your party of 4, yes, 4, we have 4 party members instead of 3, until the very end of the second disc is the first time that even happens. As for the classes you get to use, well, your main character is Zidane, who's effectively a thief, and he's a heavy hitter. He hits very hard, he's one of the more powerful characters in terms of his attacks, but he's always a melee character unless it's in trance mode. More on trance later. Vivi is a black mage, quite literally. That's actually his species. That's plot relevant, I don't want to spoil the elements there, but there's a lot of development when it comes to Vivi and where he comes from and who he is. Princess Garnet and Aiko are white mages slash summoners. They do both, though they kind of mix up their spells, where Garnet has more summons she can use, but Aiko has more offensive white magic, so you can kind of balance them out that way. Freya is a dragoon, period, end of story. Steiner is a warrior. Quina is, well, Quina is Quina. Quina is hysterical. All she cares about is frogs, and eating food, and getting food. Anything she does is motivated by food. She is the comic relief of the game for the most part. And some people don't like her, but she's really funny, so you gotta give her that. She also has blue magic, but she works weirdly in that to get blue magic, the spells for her to use, you have to eat the enemies you're fighting. You have to weaken them and then have Quina eat them, and then she gets a spell. And I keep saying she, but no one actually knows exactly what gender Quina is. I say she just because, but it could easily be a he. Nobody really knows. Oh, and last is Amarant, who's kind of like a monk. Since each character has something effectively unique to bring to the table, it means you mix up your party based on their classes, not necessarily just which ones you think are prettier. Which also makes them feel like more real people. Their abilities are directly tied to their backgrounds as characters, the kind of training they've had or their upbringing, and every character, much like Final Fantasy VII, is developed in such a way that gives them their own unique take. Like, there's an overall story that's great here too, but each character also has their own unique story arc that develops them personally on a certain level. 7 was great at that, offering many sub-stories that were heartbreaking and sometimes heartwarming. 9 does the same thing, where each character has their own arc, and it tells a story for each and every one of them, so you can get to know them a bit better. And you get attached to your party, the characters you're playing as, the characters you're utilizing, even characters you don't necessarily play as. There are temporary party members that also help you fight, such as General Beatrix, who's one of the most powerful characters in the game, who's amazing, by the way. I love Beatrix. The story carries you forward, trying to solve the mystery of what's really going on, who's really behind everything that's been happening. At first it may seem like, oh, just a crazy queen trying to take over the world, but no, there's more going on here. There's actually other forces outside of the planet you're on that are influencing the events, some of which are even tied to what's going on with the Black Mages or the main character Zidane. Zidane is one of my favorite characters from any medium ever, period. Zidane as a person influenced me so much growing up. When I was a kid, mind you, I was young when I played this game, and I played the game as Zidane, I said to myself, I would like to grow up to be just like that guy. Because the thing about Zidane is that unlike a lot of characters who get a lot of crap for either being whiny or emo or edgy, Zidane is always optimistic. It doesn't matter what the situation is, he always tries to push people forward and come up with a plan to try to deal with the situation. He's got his flaws, he's a bit of a womanizer, and he constantly flirts. More importantly, he works to build up his friends. He always tries to encourage them, to help them through their hard times. And this isn't because Zidane himself is in a good place in his life. There's a lot of mystery surrounding him too that he doesn't talk about. He doesn't know a lot about his past, but he doesn't actually open up about it that often. Instead, as a coping mechanism, he helps others feel better about themselves and tries to deal with their issues and help them be better because he doesn't know how he can help himself otherwise. And the thing about him is you don't even realize that about him from the get-go. It takes until the second disc before Zidane opens up to anybody, and through indirect means explains that he doesn't know where he comes from or even who his parents are. But he doesn't get upset about it. He doesn't whine or mope or be emo or cut people off. If anything, he's more social as a result, and he's always trying to push people forward to better themselves, to be happier, to solve their problems, to help them out, because he cares. His quote, which runs in the beginning of the game, is that you don't need a reason to help somebody. And I can't tell you how many times I've quoted that dealing with any situations in my real life, because I think it's so important, especially in this day and age, where we have people, even online, offline, wherever, that really only seem to care about their own well-being. Now, self-care is important, don't get me wrong, but I think the world could deal with a lot more kindness, and Zidane kind of represents what good can come from just being nice to people, even if it doesn't really necessarily benefit you. A lot of people don't do anything unless it helps them out, but the idea of altruism is expressed greatly with Zidane's character. He's a good guy, and is definitely underappreciated in the overall Final Fantasy medium, just like the rest of his game is, for that matter. It also didn't help that a certain person who may be named after cutlery not only has sneered at this game multiple times, even though it clearly represents the kind of game that he would like Final Fantasy to be, but he also went out of his way to specifically say regarding Zidane that he hates whiny preteen characters, which is hysterical because it only shows that he never bothered to give the game a chance at all, or the character, because if you played the game, you'd know that Zidane never whines, basically at all. And, okay, yeah, he's 16 years old, but I don't think that really means anything in the grand scheme of things. Most of the characters in Final Fantasy historically have been teenagers. Zidane is one of the most positive, optimistic characters ever established as a protagonist in Final Fantasy, compared to Cloud, who, admittedly in his own game, he would get a bit more emo later, was a fairly competent leader, especially when he, remembered who he really was. He became, personable and happy. And Squall, who is just an edgelord beyond reasonable comprehension, Zidane is a bit of a breath of fresh air, where he's this positive element that keeps the crew together, even working with people who don't actually like him. Early game Steiner doesn't like him at all because he thinks Zidane is a thief, which, to be fair, Zidane actually is, and he even threatens Zidane's life multiple times, but Zidane still brings him along because he's trying to help Princess Garnet, who Zidane cares about greatly, and whether or not Steiner believes that or not is not relevant to Zidane because he's going to help her regardless of how much complaining that Steiner does. And that's the other thing about this game. Steiner is an example of development because Steiner gets so much better as the game progresses. He actually has a big arc where he realizes that he's been acting wrongly and changes for the better. He grows to respect Zidane, and he grows to recognize that blindly following your queen's orders may not be a way to live. Yes, there's loyalty and fealty in being a knight, but in life there's also times where you have to say, am I really doing the right thing, regardless of what my orders are? It's something he had to address, and it's handled in a really good way, and everyone is. I don't want to go into detail, but Freya's story is heartbreaking. Vivi's is too. Oh my god, Vivi's arc is just rips your soul out, and Aiko's an orphan. The game has its serious moments, but it tries to be upbeat about everything and carry you forward to make you want to play the game. It hits your soul and makes you feel bad for the characters, but it also wants you to keep playing to help them out because they seem like such great people. And believe me, the game's story gets serious. You witness multiple genocides. Multiple genocides! Okay? And this is all linked back to the main villain of the game, Kuja, who is one of my favorite villains ever. And I know he looks a little, androgynous. Yes, that's the word we're gonna go with. Androgynous. And he definitely has a unique style about him, but that goes along with him being unique as a villain, I think, too, especially where Final Fantasy is concerned. Usually, the Final Fantasy villains have an endgame of become a god or take over the world, or something of that nature. In fact, I think the last 3 villains prior to 9 effectively wanted to become deities. Ultimecia wanted to compress time and rule over all of it, becoming a god as a direct result. Sephiroth wanted to make a wound on the planet and absorb that energy to become a god. And Kefka wanted to become a god. I feel like we're running with a theme here where all these villains want to be god. But Kuja really doesn't have that endgame in mind. In fact, for the most part, he doesn't really have much of an endgame in mind. I mean, he does, but a lot of what he does is for pure personal amusement and for no other reason. Kuja is different from the other villains because he himself, while he is a very powerful mage, isn't necessarily that strong in the grand scheme of things. Compared to someone like Ultimisia or Sephiroth, who's unspeakably powerful, Kuja is comparatively quite weak in terms of offensive capabilities, at least until he goes trance, which I still haven't talked about, I should probably get to that. But what makes Kuja such a competent and interesting villain is his power and capacity for intelligent manipulation. Kuja adores screwing with people, messing them about, and forcing them to commit catastrophes, all on their own. He leads them down the path of ruin, but he doesn't actually make them do anything. He simply predicts that that's where their minds are going to go because he knows how to use people. And that's what I think makes Kuja so scary. And that, coupled with the fact that Kuja is in no way insane compared to Sephiroth, who was out of his mind, that makes him a little more alarming and scary as a villain in that regard, because Kuja isn't crazy. He's completely aware of what he's doing. He just thinks it's hilarious. He thinks that messing with people and watching people die is funny. Watching people go through these lengths to gain power only to be crashed into ruin is hilarious to him, because he, of all the villains, thinks he is far superior to everyone else around him. Literally, by the end of the game, the reason he does start doing a plan to effectively annihilate the planet, I'll just tell you, is because he finds out that he's not immortal, that he is going to die. And the notion that the universe would exist without him is not something he is going to deal with. He literally decides that he would rather destroy the entire universe rather than allow himself to die, because he doesn't believe the world would be a good place without him in it. He is that full of himself. And it's just, yo, dude, chill pill. That's ridiculous, but I love it. Like, he's such a good villain. He's intimidating without actually being overtly powerful or even that often really killing someone with his own hand. He always has someone else do it for him because he's that intelligent, manipulative kind of villain, not the outrageously powerful one who does everything by himself like Sephiroth was. So it's a bit of a different take on what a villain can possibly be, and I really appreciate Kuja's character in that regard. Also, yes, I keep forgetting, we should probably talk about trance. What is trance? So trance is, well, I was about to say it's like limit breaks. And in the vein, it does the same thing. The trance meter fills up for each individual character as you get hit, and when it maxes out, you go into trance form. Now that sounds like a limit break, but keep a couple things in mind. First of all, it takes a while to get into trance. That meter does not fill up in one fight, unlike limit breaks, which comparatively could happen fairly easily. But the trade-off here is that trance is far more powerful and lasts multiple turns. Each character's trance ability is unique, so it changes, and they do change form as well. I really like the condition. It's actually really cool being able to just, blow through a boss by surviving long enough to go into trance. It's possible to plan and have your meter at such a level where you know it'll go into trance, or there's a good chance it will, but it's not necessarily something you're going to be able to predict that easily. But again, the trade-off here is that it is immensely powerful and completely changes fights. I've won multiple fights that I was about to lose purely because someone went into trance, and their power output quadruples. It's nuts. Ultimately, would I recommend Final Fantasy IX? What kind of question is that? Did you ask me that? I just led with this being one of my top 3 games ever. Are you kidding? Sorry, I don't mean to yell. It was a dumb question, okay? And you may be saying, I didn't ask that question. You asked that question, Darkness, implying that I was going to ask the question. But you don't know if I asked the question. So you're accusing me and putting words in my mouth, and you're just yelling at a camera. And you're right, I am. I should go for a walk. Final Fantasy IX is a great game. Absolutely wonderful. If you like JRPGs and haven't tried this, really? Dude, come on. It's really one of the last hurrahs for the classic Final Fantasy. It's one of the last times we really got a solid throwback to the old style games. I will say 10 still had enough elements to be recognizable, but past 9, this is where the series really went out in left field and started getting strange. Things got weird from here on. Whether you like the new Final Fantasy games, I'm not gonna judge you, but I don't think any of the main series games have felt like what I associate with Final Fantasy since 9. So I would say that if you're missing the old school RPG feeling and you haven't played Final Fantasy 9, absolutely pick it up and give it a try. It is available on Steam, so it's readily available for you to pick up and play, and I think it's available on a few of the other marketplaces as well. So there's no reason for you guys to sit back and not appreciate something that you may have overlooked by thinking that it was either meant for little kids, or you were just waiting for a PS2, or you just thought that 7 was better because, the edge or something. I don't know, man. Sephiroth, I get that, okay? It's fine. Will we ever see more of 9 like we've gotten treatment with 7? I doubt it. The notion of that would imply they're going to remake a lot of the other Final Fantasy games as well. Square Enix can't even get through a remake of 7 without breaking it up into multiple games. Are you kidding me? The idea that they'd ever remake 9 is completely out in the cosmos. Like, I can't picture them ever doing anything like that, or even doing anything like 9 ever again, because the industry's changed. The culture's changed. A lot of modern gamers don't associate RPGs with the kind of game 9 was. 9, like I said, was a throwback to the old school RPGs, the turn-based stuff, the stuff that we grew up with as kids on the Super Nintendo or the Genesis or the original Nintendo Entertainment System. It was the kind of game that reminded us what old JRPGs was and what the magic of playing them could really be. And modern games just don't really have that anymore. They're good on their own, but they've changed, and everything's changed. And with 16, it looks like they're going to go down the realm of realism again and do something a lot like 15. So I can't say I expect another throwback anytime soon or even ever again. I'm not saying the new games are bad, I'm just saying that I do miss what 9 represented for me. And the fact that it got me into the series in general, I think should speak for itself. It's a great, great game, and I hope you give it a try, because I think it's worth it. So with that, till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.